Thanks for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here today and to be talking about a framework with which to look at blockchain consensus protocols. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I think is to define consensus in the blockchain setting. So when we're talking about consensus in the blockchain setting, we're talking about distributed nodes coming to agreement on the state of the ledger. Now, this is something that everyone in this room is pretty familiar with. But I think is really one of the crucial and fundamental components of this technology. If we want all of these distributed nodes located around the globe to be able to talk to each other to reach agreement, then we need a consensus process. And so this is one of the fundamental innovations behind this technology. And so what's the consensus that we're probably all most familiar with today? Well, that's probably Bitcoin's proof of work and Nakamoto consensus. So I'm going to take a second before we continue to just make the distinction between proof of work and Nakamoto consensus. So when I'm talking about Nakamoto consensus, I'm talking about how we actually decide which part of the Bitcoin blockchain is correct. And so this is what you probably have heard of as the longest chain rule. So whichever chain is the longest chain in a Bitcoin blockchain is what we consider the canonical chain. And that's what I'm going to refer to as Nakamoto consensus. Now, when I'm talking about proof of work, I'm talking about a Sybil control mechanism. So when I'm talking about a Sybil control mechanism, I'm talking about prevention of Sybil attacks. So in a Sybil attack, we have all of these different accounts that are trying to maybe take down the network in some way. So it's my goal, or our goal as a provider of consensus, to make sure that we can prevent these kind of attacks and to have some mechanism that allows us to be robust to those. And so that's what proof of work allows us to do. It's incentivizing me to keep all of my hash power in one account to make it more likely that my block gets chosen to add to the chain. But what's the issue here? We're trying to scale out these blockchain systems to be able to support lots of different transactions, but proof of work, while a really good first step, isn't the thing that's going to get us to scale. It's not super energy efficient. So we need some sort of scalable Sybil control mechanism that still allows us to have this property. And so now a lot of different public ledgers are looking to proof of stake as their next Sybil control mechanism. And in proof of stake, I'm basically bonding some sort of amount of funds to a network to be a validator. So I stake X amount of dollars, and then usually that's the amount of power that I have in this network. Now, this is a widely untested Sybil control mechanism, and there may be many others that exist, but this is currently the one that's most exciting to a lot of people in industry and academia. And so a lot of the different protocols, especially in the permissionless setting, are looking to proof of stake. And so most of what I discuss today will be in that context. So I mentioned that there are all of these new consensus protocols that are coming out. People are trying to build the next generation of protocols that's going to allow this technology to scale. And then I'll often get asked, OK, so which one's the best? Which one should I use? And I think it's obviously a very fair question. But I think the real answer here is that every protocol is unique. So there's no objectively best protocol, but rather there's a best protocol for your needs or for your use case. And so the goal with the talk is to break down the format of these consensus protocols so that you can understand, when you look at any specific one, how to break it down and figure out what's best to fit your particular needs. So the first thing for us to understand is the network model. And when we're talking about the network model, we're talking about how nodes pass different messages to each other. And so the strongest assumption that we can make here is that we're operating in the synchronous model. So in the synchronous model, we have a known upper bound on message delay. So every single node in the network knows how long it'll take a message to get to them. And the reason that we say that this is the strongest assumption is because in this case, we're essentially saying that every message is going to get to every other node. But this isn't always practical to make. This is something that we can assume under pretty reliable communication channels. But what if we're working over unreliable communication channels? Then we're going to weaken that assumption. And so that's when we have the partially synchronous model, where there is still this upper bound on message delay, but it's unknown. So it could be between, say, like 2 seconds to 10 years. And then weakening that even further, we have the asynchronous case, where we have no upper bound on message delay. So my message could arrive instantaneously or not at all. So if I'm working in a realm where I have unreliable communication channels, then what I want is to get as close to the asynchronous model as possible. But that said, reaching agreement in the asynchronous case is definitely the most difficult. So there's a large spectrum here, and that's, I think, a theme that we'll see throughout these protocols is that we often have a spectrum from really strong to really weak assumptions, and it's important to understand where your needs lie on this spectrum. So the next thing that we want to consider is the adversarial model. So what kind of malicious actors are we going to be handling? And there are different types of adversaries. So we have crash faults, which is when nodes will go offline permanently. And no matter what kind of consensus model you're building, it's really important to be able to tolerate these crash faults. Then we have passive adversaries, which are a bit stronger in that they can eavesdrop and try to impersonate other nodes. And then even stronger, we have active adversaries, also known as Byzantine adversaries, where different nodes can act completely arbitrarily. So depending on what kind of system you're building, whether you have different trusted actors acting as your validator set, then maybe you can have a protocol that tolerates up to passive adversaries. But say you're trying to operate in an environment where you want anyone to be able to be a validator, or you have a group of people who don't necessarily trust to the same degree, then it's going to be important that your protocol is able to handle these active adversaries. So along with the different kinds of adversaries, it's important for us to consider the timing of these adversaries. So how long does it take an adversary to actually corrupt these nodes? So there are 3 different types of timing models that we'll discuss today. So the first is the static model. And this is when nodes will say, the adversarial node will say, OK, this is the set of nodes I want to corrupt, and I've delineated that ahead of time. And now they can't change once the protocol starts executing. But then we have mildly adaptive adversaries who can corrupt participants in some time between instantaneous and infinite. And then the strongest case, where we have these strongly adaptive adversaries who can corrupt participants instantaneously. So again, we have this spectrum. And depending on the types of people you have as validators in your network, you want to be able to tolerate different types of adversaries. So if you have some sort of situation where you have a really untrustworthy validator set, then you want to make sure your protocol handles these strongly adaptive adversaries. And then we have the economic model. And when we're talking about the economic model, we're talking about how we incentivize actors to actually participate in consensus. So if we don't have different validators all across the network participating within your network, then you don't get the effects of decentralized technology. So it's really important that there is some sort of incentive for people to participate. So again, this really depends on the effect that you're trying to achieve. So if you have some sort of very targeted use case and a known set of players, then maybe you don't need an economic model. Maybe these people want to participate because it's beneficial to all of them working on that use case. But say you have some sort of large-scale permissionless network, then it's really important to have some sort of reason for different people to participate. And so this is why in Bitcoin we have the mining reward for people who act as validators. But like I said earlier, we're trying to move away from Bitcoin and we're trying to move away from proof of work. So how does this work in the proof of stake case? And this is very much an open question, which is of a lot of interest. You're basically trying to create these little financial systems and build new economic models to incentivize players to act in these cases. And so this brings, again, like a whole set of experimental protocols and experimental questions, but is something that's going to prove to be very important. And so now that we've talked about the network model, the adversarial model, and the economic model, we know what kind of underlying assumptions we're making when we're crafting these consensus protocols. And the next thing for us to look at is the general steps that these algorithms follow. And so usually follow this order, where we'll start by choosing a proposer and choosing a committee to decide what the block is, and then verify the block. Then once we've decided what our block is, we'll want to propagate that to the rest of the network. Then we want to ensure that that block gets finalized. And then for many of these protocols, we also want to be able to handle churn, so handle participants both joining and leaving the network. And so we'll go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into a couple of those steps. And so the first thing I want to talk about in that vein is the security of randomness. And now we might be thinking, OK, well, how does this relate to anything I just said? But the security of randomness is actually directly tied to proposer and committee election. So let me explain. So let's go back to this example of Bitcoin, something we're all pretty familiar with. So how does the next person get chosen to propose a Bitcoin block to the blockchain? Well, that's whoever solves this random proof of work puzzle, right? So in this case, proof of work, weighted by the hash power of any given miner, is the way that we're generating randomness. But in the proof of stake case, we don't have this. We don't have this puzzle that miners are trying to solve. And so we need some other source of randomness, a complete other algorithm to determine randomly who's going to be our proposer and who's going to be our set of committee who will be able to validate the block that the proposer proposes. And so when we're looking at these randomness protocols, it's really important that they follow this set of properties. And so there are 3 different properties that are important for us to consider. The first is predictability. So before we get into the properties, actually, let me describe a little bit how these randomness functions work. So you can just think of it as a function that takes in an input. We'll call that input the seed. And then it produces some sort of output. So when we're talking about these protocols, we want to make sure that they're not predictable. So I don't want anyone to know the output of this randomness function ahead of time. I also don't want them to be biasable. So I don't want any group of people to be able to manipulate this output. And then I don't want my seed to be revealed before the current round. So what that means is, say we're running a protocol and we're at round 1. But I'm a malicious actor, and I know the seed for round 10. Then I essentially know who the proposer and who the committee members are going to be for round 10, and I can conduct some sort of denial of service attack, so that proposer and those committee members are offline at round 10, making them unable to perform their function. So that's why we don't want the seed to be revealed before the current round. So dealing with this whole randomness thing definitely adds a lot of technical complexity. And if you know that you have a trusted set of validators in your network, then maybe it's not as important to hit the strongest degree of all these 3 properties. Maybe it's OK for you to have some sort of deterministic consensus protocol. But if you're trying to operate in some sort of landscape where you don't know who these validators are and you're not making any assumptions, then you want to have a really secure source of randomness. So the next thing that we'll dive into a little bit more is finality. So finality in the blockchain setting is the affirmation that well-formed blocks won't be revoked once they've been committed to the blockchain. And we'll go ahead and discuss 2 major types of finality: probabilistic finality and absolute finality. So probabilistic finality is probably what, again, we're most familiar with. This is the type of finality that exists in Bitcoin. So say that this is my Bitcoin blockchain, and I have this one long chain, and then a couple of forks coming off of this 3rd block. And then the block that I care about is the green block, because that's the one that has my transaction. So in this case, because the green block is pretty deep into this chain, I can be pretty sure that it's finalized. I know that it'll take someone a lot of money or a lot of hash power to build a chain that goes that far that it can revoke the green block. Whereas if I'm looking at these smaller forks here, then I don't really know which one's going to be chosen yet. So the reason we call it probabilistic finality is because the deeper my block gets into the chain, the greater the probability is that it's final. Whereas if I have my green block here on this smaller chain, then I'm really not going to want to act on whatever that transaction was saying, because I have no idea which one of these 3 chains is going to be chosen as the one that eventually becomes part of the longest chain. And so that's probabilistic finality. Then we have absolute finality. And this is the type of finality that's followed by PBFT-based protocols. So this would be protocols like Tendermint, if you're familiar. And in this case, we have a leader that's going to propose a block. and then that leader is going to go ahead and send that block to a committee, and it's the committee's job to decide if that block is valid or invalid. So the committee will all decide, and in this case, we have a majority of our committee saying that this block is valid. Great. And the specific threshold of the committee that needs to decide whether the block is valid or not for the whole protocol to consider the block valid is different for different protocols. But in this case, we have a valid block, and now we're happy, and our block is immediately finalized. And so that's the property that absolute finality will give you. So to understand finality a little bit better, it'll be important for us to take a step back and consider the CAP theorem from distributed systems. So if you haven't heard of it before, the CAP theorem stands for consistency, availability, and partition tolerance, and states that in the case of a partition, a distributed system can only preserve either consistency or availability. So let's explore this a little bit more. So let's say I have a network of nodes, and they're all in the blue state here, and then they're divided by a partition. So all that means is that nodes on either side of the partition can no longer communicate with each other. There's this giant wall between nodes on either side. And now let's say I'm trying to send some messages to this network. So I'm trying to send a purple message to one side of the network and a green message to the other side of the network. But because I want to preserve consistency, I would rather my whole protocol halt than allow messages to either side that would make the protocol disagree. So I would want to keep my state of nodes all blue versus allowing in this purple message or this green message. But if I have an availability preserving system, then I want my system to continue operating even if it disagrees with each other. So this is when I'm going to let that purple message in, and this is when I'm going to let that green message in. So now how does that relate to what we were talking about with absolute and probabilistic finality? Well, it helps us understand a little bit more the nuance that these types of finality provide us. So in the absolutely final case, I have this consistency property. So I know that my block is going to be immediately finalized, but I also know that my protocol is going to halt in the case of a partition. And in the probabilistically final case, I know that my protocol is going to go ahead and continue, but it might not necessarily agree with itself at every single point in time. And so we see this with Bitcoin, for example, where we have to wait 6 block confirmations where we can act on our transaction. So it's really important to consider the properties of what you're building and then decide what kind of finality you need for your system. So if you have some sort of system where you need it to be highly available and you're OK with some inaccuracies, then you're probably fine building on top of a consensus protocol that's providing you probabilistic finality. But if you're OK with the protocol halting with achieving this consistency property, then you're going to want to build on top of a consensus protocol that provides you with this absolute finality. So in summary, we've discussed the different types of network assumptions that these protocols make. So we have the network model, the adversarial model, and the economic model. And then we went through the general algorithm that most of these consensus protocols follow. So now you're basically armed with the tool set to go ahead and look at any of these consensus protocols and start to understand what makes the most sense for you. So I definitely encourage you to go ahead and apply this to any of the Hyperledger consensus models or any other consensus models that you're interested in to try to figure out what makes the most sense. If you'd like to read more, there are a couple of links here which have some more information. And I'll be around for a little bit after if you have any questions or want to discuss any of this. Thank you so much.